Hello, and welcome back to the XR101 video lecture series. In this video, we're going to try and answer the title question: what exactly is the point of VR? What is its value or its purpose? Does VR need to exist? The simple answer to the last of these questions is yes, sometimes. One particularly useful definition of virtual reality, and yes, one I didn't include in the video specifically looking at definitions, is that VR is first and foremost a tool, specifically a technological platform, a platform for delivering all kinds of digital content. And like any tool, it might be useful, but that depends on the task at hand. Few people would question the value of a hammer, but they're equally unlikely to recommend one for peeling potatoes. So, if we consider virtual reality as a tool, then we are acknowledging it can potentially have value depending on the task, but value also depends heavily on the availability and relative cost of alternative tools. Going back to our hammer, if we need a nail inserted in a wall to hang up a picture, the hammer is the obvious choice, its physical properties being ideally suited to the requirements of the task. But let's say you don't own a hammer, and the only one available in your local hardware retailer is going for £15, and checking your cupboards, you do have a screwdriver with a pretty hefty handle. It's only a small nail anyway, it'll do, you might think. It works, the nail goes in, but at a funny angle, and now your picture's hanging, but hanging crooked. The point of this little scenario is to illustrate two things. First, that a task can have multiple means of completion, but some means may be more effective, easier, or more efficient than others. Second, is that each means of completing a task will typically have some kind of cost attached. This could be financial, but could equally be unintended side effects, greater risks of failure to complete the task, or even greater risk of personal injury. These factors set up something of an equation that needs to be considered when selecting a tool, such as virtual reality, for a particular job. We call this equation added value. Added value admits that there are multiple routes to solving a problem or completing a task, and it requires us to objectively consider different routes to find the solution that offers the greatest available value when compared fairly to all other options. Let's consider the use of virtual reality for treatment of phobic responses, so-called virtual reality exposure therapy, or VRET. Now, VRET basically uses VR to present the user with increasingly detailed or intense variations of their phobic source. This could be spiders, heights, flying, pretty much any major phobia. The idea is that exposing the patient to the real thing too quickly could make things worse rather than better. So gradually increasing the realism or intensity can give them time to adjust before you move up to the next level. Now, VRET is only one approach to exposure therapy. Other tools include physical means of increasing intensity, for example, climbing up another floor to treat a fear of heights in a physical building, using props or physical models such as spiders for arachnophobia, or even using the patient's own imagination. Now, if you explore the literature, you'll see that research studies don't just check if VRET works. They compare it to other tools to see if it works better. One study, for example, found that VR had one particular advantage against props in that it could simulate the environment in which the patient usually experienced the phobia. This was useful for patients who were, say, afraid of spiders, but specifically spiders in their own home and not anywhere else. Looking at another quick example, we could consider VR headsets in the classroom. Here, researchers directly compared VR as a platform for delivering education against more traditional means of teaching, presentations, pen and paper exercises, and so on. One study found that in many cases VR was well received by students who enjoyed using the technology, but it had no notable impact on their academic performance compared to traditional teaching, with one particular exception. They found that when teaching students about movement, position, and orientation of objects in space, planetary orbits is a good example of this, VR in this context had a significant improvement compared to traditional methods. The study concluded that this was because of how VR can represent objects in 3D space in a way that gives them a more relatable or embodied sense of meaning. Students didn't just understand the orbits as an equation or an abstract idea, They actually got to feel for how these objects moved relative to one another, and this feeling helped them consolidate and remember the maths behind the movements. It's also worth noting in this example, however, that although the authors acknowledged the advantage of VR over the alternative approach, they still did not advocate its use in the classroom. This was because of the financial implications. Fully kitting out a single class would, at the time of writing at least, have cost the school thousands of pounds. Considering that cost against the rather niche advantage of VR, and the equation simply didn't come out at genuine added value. Obviously, there are potentially hundreds of other specific examples we could look at, but there are a few points that do appear repeatedly in research literature across numerous areas of application. The first is the ability of VR to present a highly controllable environment. Being composed of digital content, VR environments can be fully designed, controlling almost anything in the virtual space, from the objects to the materials, sounds, lighting, physics, the list goes on. The second value is similar to the first. It is that in VR, the experience can typically be repeated without change. Roleplay in the real world is subject to unavoidable physical changes, such as the time of day. As VR can control every aspect of the virtual environment, it can present that environment again and again without change. The third value is safety. Just as the physical world is not fully controllable, it is sometimes not even physically safe. If we needed to become familiar with an environment with, say, no atmosphere, or dangerous chemicals everywhere, or scenarios in which we were liable to get shot, stabbed, blown up, mauled, and so on, VR gives us an opportunity to experience a simulation of such scenarios without actual risk of death or dismemberment. The fourth value is cost effectiveness. Now, I'm aware that this contradicts an earlier example of added value that I gave you, but in general, VR has been found to be a cheaper alternative. For instance, physical roleplay typically requires the hiring of actors, the provision of physical props and sets. Whilst VR might not be free, its costs can very quickly become very good value when considered against the often spiralling costs of physical roleplay. So far we've talked about the added value equation with reference to the task at hand and any available alternatives. But there is one other important factor in the equation: the stakeholders. As a general rule, VR projects that have an understanding of the stakeholders are far more likely to succeed than those that don't. The basic thinking is that different individuals and different organizations or groups will use VR for different things, and people are not the same. They come into the mix with different hopes, different expectations, previous experiences, and potentially bad attitudes. Well-designed and developed VR will be responsive to these things. Now, it's important to note here that the term stakeholder is not just another word for users. A user can absolutely be a stakeholder, but not all stakeholders are users. Stakeholders, as the name suggests, can describe any individual or group that holds a stake in the problem and its solution. So, if we take a virtual reality game, for example, then the players are obviously a very important stakeholder. But it is also very likely that the game has investors, say backers from crowdsourcing. And as the developer, it may be sensible to treat your investors slightly differently to your potential customers or players. Then say the game has a publishing company. Now we have several further stakeholders who will have unique requirements for the game. Does it fit in with their existing back catalogue? How easy will the game be to market, and so on. These aren't concerns for the players, but as the developer, they are concerns that you would need to respond to. I feel I should say that this is not a course in VR Enterprise, so we're not going to unpick the fine points of all stakeholders. But as the user is clearly at the centre of VR design, we will look at them in a little more detail. In many cases, understanding the user involves considering them carefully in the context of the task. Different people have different requirements, even if they're all using the same thing for the same purpose. But those requirements become much more diverse when the purpose or the task of the VR changes. This means that there are no absolute hard and fast rules that apply to all VR projects, and you will need to do your homework and analyse your target user group yourself in order to do the job properly. That said, there are some general areas to be aware of. One obvious area is age. Is your target audience predominantly children, teenagers, young adults, those in my own age bracket enjoying the wonders of middle age, or the elderly? Another key area is culture. What language should the VR solution cater for? Should it be multilingual? Should more universal symbols be used instead of language as text? Are there certain cultural traditions or expectations that you need to be sensitive of? Are you at risk of causing offence? A third point is accessibility. Does your target user group have any physical or mental impairments? Can your system accommodate such individuals? One last point to consider is previous experience and established interest. Are your users likely to be new or experienced VR users? Do they have any expectations about how your software will operate or what qualities it will prioritize? Is your target user group likely to be interested in the thematic content of your software? And how do you know this? To summarize, it is absolutely essential in VR design, as with the design of almost anything, to not see your audience as one massive homogeneous mass. Never use phrases like, I want this project to appeal to everyone, or I want this project to appeal to as large an audience as possible. Anything that tries to appeal to everyone typically appeals to no one. Don't make that mistake. Hopefully this video has given you a better understanding of how we can evaluate the value of virtual reality, depending on what we're thinking of using it for, what alternatives there are available, and who our target audience is. Thanks for watching.